Thank you, Rowie. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I must begin by thanking Rowie and the Centre for Urban History at Leicester for inviting me to give this paper. In one way or another, I've enjoyed a long and happy association with the Centre, the foremost research institute for urban history in Britain, and it's a pleasure and indeed an honour to be asked to deliver its annual lecture. The talk itself grows out of a very brief paper that I delivered at CUH's 25th birthday celebrations in 2010, where I was asked to speculate on possible future directions in urban cultural history and found myself making the case for a counterintuitive approach. I suggested that, to quote, the way forward for the study of urban cultural history may be the investigation of those things we least associate with the town, its margins and its past. That's why I find myself these days exploring things like pleasure gardens and walks, the Woolhope Society of Herefordshire and the Woolhope Dome, the Malvern Hill Conservators, the Cotswolds, Boars Hill on the edge of Oxford, the Bermuda Triangle of English Heritage, Warwick, Kenilworth and Stratford, and 20th century pageants. These must have seemed rather curious, even crazy words from an urban historian, particularly one who had claimed that towns, as opposed to the country, were at the cutting edge of cultural change in 18th century England. I suspect it was only the general bonhomie of the occasion, together with the freely flowing wine, which left my assertions unchallenged. But I'm grateful now for the opportunity to explain what I meant and to make the case for a counter-cultural urban history. So a few words of introduction. Much of our thinking about cities and towns, about the nature of the urban, is based upon two often unspoken assumptions: that cities are man-made and modern, man-made and modern. The first of these is, in a sense, simply stating the obvious. Cities are inevitably constructed by human beings. How else could they be built? But hiding behind a statement of the obvious lies something less articulated, but nonetheless equally clear, that cities are spaces in which the human will has imposed itself over nature. At one point in his City in History, Lewis Mumford, while discussing the crystallisation of the city, refers to the manner in which, to quote, the gigantic forces of nature were brought under conscious human direction. Given this view, then it's arguable that the human story is one of man's progressive taming of nature, and that the city, a product of human endeavour, is the instrument for this taming process. Thus there appears an antithesis between the man-made and the natural, the city and nature. In spatial terms, this eventually translates into the difference between the city and the country, a distinction which Raymond Williams argues acquired widespread usage from the 16th century in England, to quote, with increasing urbanisation and especially the growth of the capital, London. In this light, the urban historian's mission is to concentrate on the process of human construction rather than the forces of nature. Some may say on grey rather than green space. Implicit in the notion of a long-term, albeit sometimes faltering process by which man tames and controls the natural world through the instrument of the city are the notions of progress and, specifically, modernity. These, I suggest, are the other themes that we're always being encouraged to explore in the history of the city. The geographer Arthur Smales claimed cities flowered first in the Middle East. Their appearance was accompanied by great advances in human knowledge and technical equipment. The sociologist Gideon Schoberg claimed from its inception the city, as a residence of specialists, has been a continuing source of innovation. The very emergence of cities greatly accelerated social and cultural change. Cities are thus portrayed as in the vanguard of change and innovation, as inherently sites of progress and modernity, and as the vehicles through which human progress has been facilitated. And very easily this notion slips into the idea that cities, and by implication not the country, are also the locations in which civility and civilization are forged. As Richard Le Gates and Frederick Stout declare resoundingly and confidently in the opening words of the introduction to their city readers, cities are civilization. The central place of cities as the incubators and sustainers of advanced culture remains a theme common to 19th and 20th century thinkers. The culture of cities and our notions of civilization are virtually indistinguishable. Cities, then, are about the future. In the light of this, it's perhaps understandable that urban historians would wish to concentrate their attention on this and not the past. So urban historians are, in a sense, hardwired to focus on and find the man-made and, even though they are historians, the modern, whether this be in ancient, medieval, early modern or contemporary society. What reinforces this process is what one may call the big objective fact about the urban past, the long-term global trend towards urbanisation. One doesn't have to subscribe to any simple linear notion of urban growth. Cities can rise and fall, countries urbanise and de-urbanise. One hasn't to subscribe to that notion to recognise that in Penny Caulfield's conclusion, in the words of Penny Caulfield's conclusion to the recent Oxford Handbook of Cities in World History, despite much turbulence, the collective urban saga has developed not steadily but inexorably in the long term, from the first creation of Babylon into an urbanised world of Babylonia. And one does not have to be overly progressive in belief to share her view that becoming globally urban is one of our great collective achievements through time. The trend, particularly evident since the 19th century, from a position where the vast majority of people lived in rural settlements and small towns, to one where in many countries a clear majority, in some cases a substantial majority, occupied large towns, cities and metropolises, what may be called the demographic reversal, is too obvious and global to ignore. One estimate places the proportion of the world population living in settlements of 20,000 or more in 1800 at 2.25%, in 1900 just under 10%, and by 2000 at just under 40%. Cities then could be seen to represent the present and future, and therefore the modern. And to the extent that they offered a solution of how to accommodate vastly growing numbers of people in tightly restricted spaces, they also represented the triumph of the man-made over the natural environment. Urbanisation and the demographic reversal has given rise to forms of culture that are overtly urban, man-made and modern. Anything from social and cultural institutions such as coffee houses, clubs, associations, assemblies, museums and cinemas, to built environments incorporating streetscapes, squares, sporting stadia and complex infrastructural networks and planning schemes, and to the sort of experiential culture enjoyed by the promenader and flaneur, and arguably the forms of political culture such as democracy. However, and this is the nub of my argument, urbanisation and the demographic reversal, while at the same time as generating a man-made and modern culture, has also paradoxically and dialectically stimulated the opposite cultural response, a yearning among urban populations for the natural and the historic. As the pace of urbanisation accelerated, city and town dwellers appear to have reacted more and more against the man-made and modern environment in which they found themselves, in the process creating an increasingly sophisticated counterculture that urban historians have tended to shy away from exploring. So, let me begin with green space, or the natural. I'm going to focus on the case of England. Their levels of urbanisation rise substantially during the early modern period, especially with the explosive growth of London from a city of 50, 60,000 in 1500 to almost 1 million by 1800, and rise dramatically during the course of the 19th century. Whereas a third of the UK population lived in towns in 1850 and 2/3 in the countryside, by 1920, 2/3 lived in towns and a third in the countryside. To what extent did this represent a triumph of grey over green space? Historically speaking, green space has always been part of English towns. Substantial unbuilt space might exist within the walls of the larger medieval and early modern cities such as Norwich and Oxford. And there was also a considerable peripheral belt of fields directly associated with the city and town, much of it held as common land. Moreover, the vast majority of pre-modern towns had no walls and were small in size, some no more than a few hundred people, with their edges merging easily with the surrounding countryside, and their economies closely integrated with that of rural society. 17th century Warwick was not a small town by contemporary standards, but a county capital with almost 3,000 inhabitants in 1700. Yet in the 1690s, the 5 suburban wards contained over 150 thatched barns and a large expanse of common land lay to the north of the town on what is now the site of the racecourse. Though this green space within and outside the town would very likely have been used for military training and recreational purposes, its primary function was as working space, not only for agriculture, but also industry, such as accommodating tenting frames. Given its predominant economic function, it's questionable to what extent this space was perceived and experienced as culturally green. That is, as in some way expressive of nature. However, during the early modern period, change was afoot, and urban green space began to be consciously conceived of as representative of nature, particularly in London, whose dramatic expansion was creating a large concentration of population with only limited contact with the agricultural world. The result, as Raymond Williams suggests, is the emergence of the distinction between city and country, and, as a reaction to urbanism, of a town person's idealised notion of nature. This manifested itself in various cultural forms, notable literary, but also in the first conscious identification and landscaping of public urban green space, with, in the case of London, the laying out of moorfields early in the 17th century, and the royal parks and commercial pleasure gardens a little later. These were, of course, highly contrived spaces involving a good deal of human artifice, but the intention to capture an idealised form of nature was clear enough. These London cases were, at least originally, sited on the edge of the metropolis, occupying a peripheral zone between town and country and mediating between the two. The same went for the provincial town walks and gardens that began to proliferate from the late 17th century, many located on elevated sites that gave extensive and sometimes spectacular views of the surrounding countryside, such as the Park Walk in Shaftesbury. Many also ran along the banks of urban rivers, such as the New Walk along the Ouse at York, indicative of the early inclusion of blue space into the urban idea of nature. The greening of the urban landscape ran in parallel with a more widely researched and celebrated development, that of landscape gardening on the country estates of the British landed gentry and aristocracy. The story is well known, with the rise of the English garden, or jardin anglais, as it became known, called by some commentators the greatest English cultural achievement of the 18th century, and undoubtedly a hugely influential cultural export. It was characterised by its abandonment of continental geometrical forms of land and water landscaping in favour of free-flowing, curvaceous ones that appeared to mimic nature. The relationship between the country estate and urban garden landscaping is one that needs further research, particularly in relation to an increasingly urbanised landed elite. but the country estate undoubtedly played an important part in pioneering new, wilder notions of nature and was influential in the design of the municipal parks that became such a feature of urban green space in the 19th century. By the early 20th century, Aberystwyth possessed a public garden bearing the name the Elysium Grove, no doubt appropriating the name of the famous Elysium Grove at Stowe. There's in fields at Stowe, so there's Aberystwyth in the early 20th century, the Elysium Grove, now built over, I think, and there's its more famous model. Country estate landscaping took a turn to the wild side with the emergence of more radical forms of natural gardening in the later 18th century, under the umbrella of the picturesque movement. Forged within a group of aesthetically minded country gentlemen, Richard Payne-Knight, Udale Price and Thomas Johns, and in the county, Herefordshire, located on the edge of England and bordering wild Wales, the smoothscaping of Capability Brown was rejected in favour of the more rugged forms that were seen to better reflect real nature. Solution in the case of Payne-Knight and Johns was to take an already dramatic rocky river landscape on their remote estates, Downton Gorge on the River Teme, in the case of Payne-Knight and the Upper Aberystwyth Valley in that of Johns, and remodel these spaces as gardens, Downton Castle and Havard, bringing out, as they would see it, their inherent natural characteristics. Herefordshire was also the site of one of the earliest romantic hotspots in the form of the Wye Gorge, made famous, though already well appreciated before its appearance on the scene, by another theorist of the picturesque movement, William Gilpin, and his observations on the River Wye. No human remodelling of the landscape was attempted here. This was pure nature. But Gilpin's guide did in practice provide tourists with a form of mental modelling. Now, what were the implications of the development for urban landscaping and green space? On the face of it, the picturesque movement was not good news. Aesthetic trends were pointing in the direction of wilder and wilder, remoter and remoter landscapes. Quite apart from the fact that these were likely to be located some distance from towns and in thinly populated areas, there was not the space in towns to garden on this scale. However, towns were able to respond to and exploit the new cultural fashions in a variety of ingenious ways. First, though the picturesque sites were apparently remote, there was often a town relatively close by to service the site, providing visitors with essential accommodation, transport and other tourist comforts. Indeed, it's arguable that without such urban services, the sites would not be viable as tourist locations. The classic Wye Valley tour was a 2-day trip by boat, which began at the town of Ross-on-Wye, broke off for its midpoint at Monmouth, perhaps staying at the Beaufort Arms, and was completed at Chepstow. In reality, the Wye Gorge was not all that remote. For example, with the arrival of the first steam packet boats in Chepstow in 1822, the Wye Valley became accessible to day trippers from Bristol. Havard, Thomas John's property in Cymystwyth, Ceredigion, was undoubtedly remote in the sense that it was located a good distance from the English border, but it lay only a few miles from Aberystwyth, a port developing since the 1760s as a sea bathing resort. And this brings us to the second point, and here it is as much about blue as green space. As well as developing a picturesque garden on his Herefordshire estate at Foxley, Udale Price also built a house in 1794 in Aberystwyth. Designed by non John Nash in the picturesque Gothic Revival style, it was located on a rocky outcrop on the very edge of the sea, with windows so angled as to catch the view across the bay, the stage still without a promenade, towards the dramatic dark mass of what was to become Constitution Hill. The prospect embraced both land and water, and with the sea incorporated a form of nature even less subject to human control, more open to the unbridled forces of nature than the land. Aberystwyth was one of a category of towns emerging across Britain from the early 18th century, what we now call seaside resorts, with their bathing and boating facilities and their extensive infrastructures of cliff walks, promenades and piers, specifically geared to providing their visitors with the opportunity to experience untrammelled nature. Significantly, the first cluster of seaside resorts emerged in about the 1730s in the southeast of England, on the Isle of Thanet and the Sussex coast, the optimum point to service London's gargantuan urban population. Later phases of development brought into the resort system the west and east coasts of Britain, responding to the demand generated by urban growth in the Midland and North industrial towns, and to improve transport links. Uvedale's Price's house in Aberystwyth showed what a premium was now placed on the sea view. This sat in marked contrast to the traditional orientation of most houses in maritime resorts, which usually faced inland with their backs to a sea that was seen as a functional resource, and a dangerous one at that, with no aesthetic merit. With the rise of the seaside resort, urban coastal residential architecture underwent a dramatic inversion, with scores of villas, terraces and crescents constructed along the shorelines and cliffs to maximise sea views. The origins of these building types, particularly the terraces and crescents, lies partly in London, but more specifically in the spas, which acted as a model for seaside development well into the 19th century. The crescent was an invention of Bath and was designed to provide an elegant and elevated residential platform from which to view the surrounding countryside. This highlights the fact that spas themselves cultivated an ambivalent image that mixed the urban and the rural. On the one hand, they supported a highly urbane lifestyle and built environment. On the other hand, they were frequently located in rural locations, surrounded by hills, and were subject to intensive levels of green landscaping that blurred the boundary between town and country. One thinks of Buxton, Matlot and Harrogate, the later Victorian and Edwardian Mid Wales spas of Llandrindod, Builth and Llanyrtyd, or indeed of Bath and Cheltenham. Bath's late Georgian expansion was accommodated on the steeply rising Lansdowne Hill, while Cheltenham was constructed in the shadow of the Cotswold Escarpment. The spas had, of course, their own associations with blue nature through the presence of the healing springs. But spa water therapy was a precarious foundation in Britain on which to build long-term success. And it seems that for many spas, it was the access they provided to green space, both their own but also that of the surrounding countryside, that underpinned their future. The Shropshire Spa of Church Stretton, for example, acted as a base camp for those exploring the Long Min. Or take the case of Malvern. This emerges as a village spa of more than local significance in the mid-18th century, but its growth into a genuine spa town spans the 19th century, with the resident population of Great Malvern expanding from 819 in 1801 to 6,000 in 1861 and 16,500 by 1901. On the face of it, Malvern's growth was all about the attraction of its medicinal waters. Well, they played a part, but it seems that by the later 19th century of equal and in all probability of greater importance was its location underneath the striking chain of hills that rise dramatically above the floodplain of the River Severn and straddle the Worcestershire-Herefordshire border. A sign of the newfound tourist potential of the hills was the acquisition in 1884 of a special Act of Parliament to protect the hills from development that might threaten their viability as a natural resource. A key part of the Act was the establishment of an organisation, the Malvern Hills Conservators, whose duty was to enforce the terms of the legislation and manage the conflicting interests not only of landowners and commoners, but also, and this quite explicitly, the general public. Among the principal groups pressing for the Act were the tradesmen and businessmen of Great Malvern, that nestled directly under the highest point on the hills, the Worcestershire Beacon. The Malvern tradesmen recognised the growing importance of the hills to their businesses. By the latter decades of the century, the Spar's guidebooks fill increasing with accounts of the environs. The records of the Malvern Hill Conservators show that they took their responsibilities as defined under the Act remarkably seriously. They met regularly to oversee the general welfare of the hills and address specific problems that arose. Perhaps most importantly, rangers were appointed to patrol the hills on a day-to-day basis and carry out maintenance work. The result was that the Malverns became intensively policed and managed, and in a manner that placed as much, if not more, emphasis upon recreational and aesthetic imperatives as on agricultural and commercial ones. Early on, a kiosk was erected on the Worcestershire Beacon, particularly that closets and urinals should be provided for public conveniency and decency. This, of course, had a practical aspect to it, but it was also about conforming to Victorian sensibilities, and in turn about a way of consuming the landscape in which the moral, political and aesthetic dimensions were woven seamlessly together. In line with this agenda, strenuous efforts were made to maintain the ordered and decorous appearance of the hills and prevent their disfigurement. Damage to the turf, the dumping of building materials and rubbish, and unseemly agricultural practices which might offend walkers were regularly reported and challenged. In 1885, the Chief Ranger, Alexander King, informed the Conservators that a man named Green is living in a very unsightly hut which he's erected near the Witch. He often keeps a great quantity of pigs, and all around the front of his dwelling he has erected temporary pigs' cots and runs, which have increased from time to time. This great nuisance must be very obnoxious to visitors who have to pass near it to get from the Witch onto the beacon. Conservation measures were taken to protect wild flowers and plant grass seeds and trees. The presence of disorderly human types such as gypsies and miscreant youths was a constant bugbear. In 1908, King reported that after being there some time, a gang of boy trippers placed a ginger beer bottle in the hill and commenced throwing stones at it. I immediately stopped them and told them they must not throw stones on the hills, and I should take their names if they did so. King recommended the erection of a notice board prescribing stone throwing, but added, I fear a great number of people do not know they're breaking the bylaws by stone throwing. The notice board could be taken in at nights, or it might be used as a target for stones. The spa town of Great Malvern and the Malvern Hills were tied inextricably together. But it was to the expanding urban centres of the West Midlands that the Spa and Hills looked for their principal market. In this sense, the Malverns were really an extension of the green space of Worcester, Kidderminster, and of course Birmingham. Throughout the Victorian and Edwardian England, picturesque, the word was continuously used into the early 20th century, picturesque landscapes were being revealed and modelled through guide literature, fictional works, paintings and photographs as recreational green spaces. The purpose was to quench the thirst of the country's expanding number of urban dwellers for contact with nature. From Dartmoor to the lakes, from Wessex to the Pennines and Yorkshire moors, imagined wildernesses were being created, tied umbilically for their lifeblood to the cities by the revolutions in personal mobility and transport provided by rail, cycle, charabanc and automobile. In this sense, the whole of the countryside was being transformed into urban green space. Moreover, with the growing dependence by the late Victorian period on agricultural imports from overseas, added to the problems of an agricultural depression, the English countryside was increasingly being valued for its recreational rather than productive functions. The tendency to urbanise the countryside was most acutely felt on city edges. There, the centrifugal forces towards suburbanisation, felt as early as the 17th century in London, were creating an ever-expanding peripheral zone of leafy streets and villas with extensive gardens, on occasions appropriating existing villages, a zone that hovered between town and country. The urban green fingers spread even further into what may be called deep suburbia, creating during the late 19th and early 20th century exclusive settlements of large architect-designed houses set in woods or fields, not directly connected to town or city, though due to development and transport within close reach of it, in which prosperous townsmen could play at being country lads and squires. One thinks, for example, of Borsay outside Oxford, or the settlement of the once forest areas in the vicinity of Windsor and Ascot. By the interwar years, there was a growing chorus of complaints about the threat of urban sprawl. Before this, the urban planners had attempted to resolve the problems of unregulated urban growth and the threat that this posed to the idea of the countryside, at the same time as satisfying the ever-increasing appetite of urban dwellers for green space and nature by evolving the notion of the garden city. Well-known illustration to you. And later that of the green belt. In truth, however, by the interwar years, the game was up. The real countryside was inexorably fading away as it was replaced by an imagined countryside that was an extension of urban green space. Indeed, as Paul Brastley and others have argued, the so-called revival of the English countryside and village in the interwar years was ultimately dependent on city wealth and commitment. So a few words now about the past. In 1910, one of the proliferating guidebooks to Warwickshire could report of finding at Bidford-on-Avon, nestling along the valley between Stratford and Evesham, a hotel on the river, a beer garden, and every accommodation, including boats, for giving the Joes and Jills of Birmingham a happy day. In decamping to the banks of the Avon, these brummy day trippers were not only entering green space but also historic space. For the small town of Bidford lay near the heart of Shakespeare land, a mythic space located temporally somewhere between medieval and Merry England, in whose turbulent history, it could be argued, an English identity had been forged. Its nerve centres were the historic towns of Warwick, Kenilworth and Stratford. The former two, the possessors of spectacular medieval castles, the latter the home of the bard whose literary works define the region and its cultural meaning. Adjacent lay Royal Leamington Spa, an undoubtedly modern town, but one that in many respects acted as the tourist service centre for the region. The precise notion of Shakespeareland probably only emerged in the late 19th century, even if the idea was present long before. Judging by the British Library's catalogue, the first use of the term may have been in the 1880s and 1890s, with John Macpherson's Land of Shakespeare, C.J.R. Turner's Shakespeareland and George Morley's Rambles in Shakespeareland. By the 1930s, at least a further 6 books had appeared with Shakespeareland in their title. The role of a literary figure in defining an imaginary region that mixed green and historic space was a common one. And like Shakespeare, who was unwittingly dragooned into the role, Thomas Hardy was consciously complicit with the creation or recreation of Wessex. As he wrote in the introduction to an edition of Far from the Madding Crowd, I believe I'm correct in stating that until the existence of this contemporaneous Wessex was announced in the present story in 1874, it had never been heard of, and the expression a Wessex peasant or a Wessex custom would therefore have been taken to refer to nothing later in date than the Norman conquest. Since then, the appellation, which I thought to reserve to the horizons and landscapes of a merely realistic dream country, has become more and more popular as a practical provincial definition, and the dream country has by degrees solidified into a utilitarian region which people can go to, take a house in, and write papers from. Towns had always been concerned about their histories. Indeed, the notion that towns were or should in some way be modern, spearheading change, would have seemed odd to medieval and early modern urban dwellers. They were forever looking to the past to justify their current status and identity, frequently rehearsing and embroidering their foundation myths and jealously guarding their civic histories. Arguably all this changed in the 18th and 19th centuries with the shake-up in the urban hierarchy and the emergence of new towns whose economic success depended upon innovatory technologies and commercial creativity. Yet the evidence also suggests that the new towns, far from embracing the future, unhampered by the baggage of their history or imagined history, were among those places that did most to promote and cultivate their past. From the mid-18th century, the industrial towns and ports of the middle and the north were, as Rowie has shown, to be among the most likely recipients of the proliferating urban histories. Significantly, the great town halls and public buildings of the industrial cities of early Victorian England, buildings which symbolised their sense of civic identity, were generally built in monumental Neo-Roman or Neo-Grecian style. Partly this was because the Sea Fathers got caught up in a fevered cycle of emulation with other new towns, but it also reflected a desire to tap the past and the Roman and Grecian notions of civic government and virtue. In this context, Manchester's adoption of a full-blown early English Gothic style for its spectacular town hall, designed by Alfred Waterhouse, begun in 1867 and opened a decade later, might seem curious and problematic. But by this time, the Gothic Revival was in full flood, infiltrating sacred and secular buildings alike. Developed by architects and theorists like Augustus Pugin and John Ruskin as a reaction to the materialism and degraded lifestyle of the modern industrial city, Victorian Gothic provided the ideal camouflage for the Manchester City Fathers. It allowed them to assert their wealth, prosperity and status at the same time as cleansing the city of its image of mammon by drawing upon the historic religious associations of the Gothic style. If some towns are using the past to mask their comparative youth, other towns are exploiting their age as a commercial asset. From the 18th century, it's possible to see the emergence of a domestic market, paralleled on the continental front by the Grand Tour, of heritage tourism, and with it the so-called tourist historic city. The favoured past for much of the 18th century was probably a classical one, and a few English cities such as Bath and York were able to exploit this. But in truth, Roman remains were few and far between. What really opened up the potential of English towns for heritage tourism was the Gothic Revival, as the fear of a Catholic counter-Reformation declined after the failure of the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, and medieval architecture slowly lost its stigma as papist and barbaric. If England's historic towns were short of classical remains, there was a surfeit of medieval churches and ruined abbeys, not to mention castles. In his 1720s tour, Defoe might have famously rejected the need to record historic features. Matters of antiquity are not my inquiry. But by the end of the century, a guidebook writer couldn't afford to be so dismissive. During the 19th century, the tourist gauge was widened to incorporate not only the medieval fabric, but also Tudor and Stuart buildings. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that historic Georgian architecture began to attract the attention of visitors and their guides. Selling a place on the basis of its past became an important business line for many towns. One device a number of towns resorted to in the early 20th century to boost and advertise their historic profile was the historical pageant. In 1905, the small Dorset town of Sherborne mounted a historical pageant to celebrate the 1200th anniversary of the founding of the school and the appointment of Aldhelm as the first bishop of Sherborne. 900 local people were recruited to perform 11 episodes, recreating the town's history from 705 to 1593. Initially, the signs of success were not auspicious, yet the press caught wind of the enterprise, publicised the event, and soon pageantitis swept across parts of what was predominantly southern Britain. Sherborne was followed by pageants at Colchester and Warwick in 1906, Bay St Edmunds, Oxford, Romsey, Liverpool and St Albans in 1907, Chelsea, Galston, Cheltenham, Dover, Pevensey and Winchester in 1908, Bath and York in 1909 and Chester in 1910. By the eve of the Second World War, the movement had spread across British towns as a whole. but at this early stage the focus on self-evidently historic tourist towns and cities is clear. Pageants involved mounting a series of theatrical tableaux depicting what were perceived to be key historical moments in a town's past. The event was usually orchestrated by a professional pageant dancer, but was organised by local grandees. Taking into account committee members, backroom staff and amateur actors, hundreds and even thousands of local people could be actively involved in a mass engagement with the past. In the Bath pageant of 1909, the number of performers was of the order of 3,000, with about 400 in the 18th century scene alone. In Bath's case, the pageant was part of a much larger project to raise the historical credentials of the town to attract tourists as the appeal of its medicinal waters began to decline. It was, significantly, a similar story to the way that other spas, like Malvern, were turning to green space as their economic saviour. Moreover, in the case of both Bath and Malvern, it was not simply a matter of either nature or the past. Bath, as we've seen, exploited its natural environment to raise its green appeal, while Malvern and its adjacent hills and countryside were rich in old villages, historical artefacts and legends. Both were parts of spaces which during the 19th and 20th century became tourist zones, embedding historic cities, towns, villages and archaeological monuments in what was perceived as a basically rural environment. In these areas, nature and the past were inextricably entwined together. A trip into the country was a trip into the past. When in the 1890s, the members of the Warwickshire Photographic Survey, a part of the Birmingham Photographic Society, undertook excursions into the county's urban and rural nooks, crannies and byways, capturing images of half-timbered cottages, ancient country houses, castles and rural labourers. They were sharing in the creation of a mythical time-space zone, crystallising into Shakespeare land, that was at heart the creation of the urban imagination. It was in a curious way the parallel, but an inverse one, of the explorations being made at the time into deepest and darkest Africa. One was outward-looking and imperial, the other inward-looking and localising. But both were journeys of discovery to find spaces that existed more in the mind than on the ground. The survey was in fact a successor of a whole movement that had begun in the 1840s with the formation of the Natural History Societies, many based on counties or large towns, which engaged in a remarkable exercise in discovering and mapping the natural and human history of their regions. Their membership was usually drawn predominantly from the towns in the region, and especially the professional middle classes, and their classic mode of investigation was the excursion, a small-scale invasion of a particularly iconic natural or historic space by the society's members, lectures and investigations on the spot, followed by collective jollification and reports for annual transactions. This is just the Warhol Club in Herefordshire, founded in 1851. They're at Arthur's Stowe. There they are in even wilder Altram Valley, Herefordshire Welsh borders. And that is their urban base. So, to conclude, the central claim of this paper is that urban historians have tended to focus on the man-made or grey space and the modern, and they've perhaps paid too little attention to nature or green and blue space and the past. These seem the very opposite of what the town stands for, but there is every reason to believe that they have always been part of the urban mix. However, paradoxically, nature and the past become an even more important part of city and town culture as urbanisation gathered pace, particularly from the 18th century, and the balance of the population shifted decisively, and in the case of England dramatically so, from country to the town. There is, to put it in a nutshell, a countercultural reaction in the town. Now, this isn't to claim that the man-made and the modern are not crucially important aspects of an urbanising culture. It's simply to suggest that nature and the past are also part of that complicated and messy mix. To see the impact of nature and the past We have in part to look inside the town, a walk, promenade, pleasure garden, park, public building, castle, cathedral and so on. But the greatest impact is probably on the urban edge and beyond, in the suburbs and deep suburbia, the maritime margins, and the imaginary territories being created, especially from the late 19th century, such as Shakespeare Land, the Lakes, the Cotswolds, the Broads, and Hardy's Wessex. As economic production concentrated more and more in the cities and large towns, so the countryside and its smaller historic towns, much of the coastline and most rivers become less economically functional and more a recreational resource, the playground of the urban population. Today, the appeal of nature and the past is huge, and with it notions of ecosystems, biodiversity, conservation and heritage. And underpinning this, there is a sort of anti-urbanism. But this return to authenticity is a chimera. There never was an authentic nature or past. The notions of nature and the past we now celebrate are as much a part and product of urban culture as the man-made and the modern. Today, some people are inclined to boast of being country boys at heart and to believe that there are votes in such a strategy as there may be in Chipping Norton, Witney and Woodstock. But the truth is that their real business lies in the city, and that is where their notion of the country has been forged.